or you can share this by communicating. Now, do anything that's illegal and unlawful, we will continue. That's not really possible in most states. Because in the end, if you do that in states, you have to cross that boundary at some point. And if you want to be able to cross that boundary, whether that's a boundary that's a picket fence, or whether it's a regional boundary, if you want to cross that boundary with any degree of security, you're going to have to reconcile at some stage.
Before you can begin a process of truth and reconciliation, there has to be a political process that precedes that, I would imagine. So, for instance, in South Africa, you had a change of regime before you actually could put that in place, that process in place. What are the prospects for that occurring in Sri Lanka, in the current regime?
Yeah.
Because, of course, the accusations of breaches of human rights are currently leveled at the present regime. So they are not going to be the people who are going to put into process an accountable and a democratic process where you can have a genuine truth and reconciliation, but the very breaches of human rights are actually, or the people who are responsible for it, are being held to account.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and in a sense, it's for you to talk about how that could occur in a Sri Lankan context. But let me just say, in the South African context, it's not true that there was a change of regime that led to the reconciliation. De Klerk was very much in charge when Mandela began the process. Mandela was a non-state actor. De Klerk was very much the government. And it's actually de Klerk's magnanimity to a certain extent, or de Klerk's, I would say, pragmatism even. I wouldn't necessarily ascribe magnanimity to it. Pragmatism to realize that actually if you're going to share the space, you're going to have to share the space together. So that was that element there. You didn't have regime change and then the truth and reconciliation process started. The process may have started in the aftermath, but the conversations started well during the time of de Klerk's regime.
But with a view that there was going to be a change
Absolutely.
of regime.
Absolutely there was.
And of course the difference with Sri Lanka, with South Africa, was that the majority were the ones who were oppressed, so to speak, or disenfranchised.
Yeah.
Whereas here you have a minority community
Sure.
who are in that position.
Please.
Can I just say that well, the first thing is I'd like to welcome what you said today, and you can be engaged with what people say, but it would be lovely if you could set out what you put to us this evening for us to take away and reflect on, because a lot of us can learn a lot from what you said today. But just in the context of Sri Lanka and South Africa, there is a marked difference between South Africa and Sri Lanka, in that the South African regime was not a democratic regime. There's a self-appointed system of democracy. The change of regime in Sri Lanka will take place, and I hope there will be, because there have been changes of government in Sri Lanka, the main two parties and the coalitions. And if the people of Sri Lanka, in a democratic process that wasn't challenged in the international forum, feel that things are being handled very badly, there will be that change of regime, but in the context of a democratic system. That's a difference.
That's a valid point. I wasn't trying to draw a parallel.
No, because I don't want to do that this evening. It's very bad.
Sure.
On the evening when you're looking for, to go forward.
Absolutely.
Come on, please, ask questions.
They're thinking about the Sri Lankan food, not ours. Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask your opinion on the role of the International Court in Sri Lanka. As, for example, the former Republic of Yugoslavia is an example of a place that had very visible justice, international justice, but without a truth and reconciliation program. What part would you say international law has to play in Sri Lanka as part of the reconciliation process or apart from it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and in a sense there are lots of debates as to whether international criminal justice is the best route forward. I mean, the trial of Saddam Hussein cost a lot of money. I'm not sure it did very much for the Iraqis, but there's question marks over those kinds of processes and what they actually achieve. Depends on the context. In the context of Sri Lanka, first of all, if you had to have a court, it would have to be with the government, because there is state sovereignty, and states have a duty, and states have the primary responsibility in terms of how they conduct issues in their particular jurisdictions. Yugoslavia was different because the government had fallen apart. Rwanda was different as well. So these are very different contexts and not strictly comparable. In the context of what role the international community could play, probably I would say the international community has taken an aggressive stance at points, questioning several processes with regards to Sri Lanka. Possibly a more useful stance would be technical cooperation. Actually saying, here's a bunch of things that need to be done, and here's a bunch of people who can help you to do it, and engaging that community, because no longer do we operate in these little segments. Everything is quite interconnected now. So gone are the days when states would say, this is an issue, you don't understand about it, you're not from here. Those arguments don't really go that well anymore, because the world is quite interconnected and people are quite interconnected. Twitter, Facebook and the like, but everything else. So engaging the international community in the search for solutions would probably be a good strategy in terms of gaining some legitimacy for those processes, but also allowing international scrutiny in. Whether that goes in the way of a court, I don't think would necessarily be perhaps the smartest option, because these kinds of processes of international justice are extremely slow and it's not always clear what they achieve.
Yes, I'm part of the defence team for Radovan Karadzic, and I'd agree with you completely in terms of the failings of some of the international criminal justice system mechanisms. But interestingly, on the international law point, isn't it going to be necessary, as you've said, if, for instance, in Sri Lanka, there was a TRC system? Part of that has got to be, presumably, be accepted by the powers that are putting a certain amount of pressure on Sri Lanka. And my question really is this, with South Africa, of which I'm not really aware of how that was set up, what sort of help was South Africa given, and what sort of acceptance was there by those that might have sought to intervene in South Africa prior to the TRC being set up?
Do you mean outside states?
Yes.
With South Africa, the TRC process, once the idea took off, it was like a torch paper. There was a huge amount of people who engaged in that process. So the South African TRC process, actually not even the South African constitution, was not written in a small room with a few people. There were lots of people who weighed in with it, and there was genuine engagement. And it was a country really searching and asking questions of itself and of the international community. The people who were behind the South African Truth Commission searched far and wide in coming up with their models. They commissioned a lot of research on it. They published the research. That research is available now. It was a really intellectually driven process with a strong spiritual element because of Tutu and Mandela in there. So that I would say were the key ingredients in the processes aside. So the intervention issue never arose, because everybody in a sense felt like they were friends trying to solve South Africa's problem. They were no longer antagonistic towards South Africa's call for help. And that made a major difference. New Zealand was quite different, because in a sense, New Zealand set up its tribunal in 1975. This is well before notions of reconciliation became fashionable anywhere else. So in that sense, New Zealand were very much pioneers there, and there were no external pressures in that particular context, because this was really about a society that was internally divided, with not that many ramifications outside.
Yes.
Just a quickie, apart from leadership, which is a crucial variable in the success of such a venture, to what extent the notion of spiritual surge, or the notion that the time has come for this idea collectively, in the collective consciousness of the nation, is the ultimate crucial variable in getting this right?
Yeah, I mean, it is the crucial element. It is absolutely the crucial element. And you can see that in both contexts. Because in both contexts, you had a small group in power that had everything, and a large group outside. Actually, in the Maori case, they weren't a large group. They were not a majority, they were too a minority. But a group outside that had nothing. So usually when you're negotiating, you're hoping that the quality of the negotiation will depend on what cards each of the parties hold. But in both the South African and the New Zealand case, the other party who was not at the table had no cards. They had none. So in many ways, it had to be that spiritual element that pushed people to accept that we, as in the ones who are enfranchised, need to be the ones who make the first step. We are the ones who need to realize, whether that's through pragmatism, or whether that's through a spiritual reason, or whether that's because you believe that human beings are equal, with equal inherent dignity and worth, whatever the motivation be, it had to come from that perspective. Because there wasn't an imperative that, oh, if you don't do this, your society will break down. That wasn't the case. So if the spirituality actually, as it happened in both cases, played a very, very central role in getting the processes off the ground.
So would you say then that might be the biggest mountain in terms of the time has come for an idea, and the collective consciousness,
Yeah.
with the spiritual underpinning, may be the two big mountains Sri Lanka may have to cross?
Quite possibly. I mean, I'm not particularly religious, and so I don't necessarily think in those terms. For me, the emphasis is on creating mechanisms that protect the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. That for me is the religion, if you like, or that for me is the drive for spiritual thinking. But absolutely, anything that would help would be useful.
Thank you.
Can I just say a small contribution to spiritual? Again, I don't know the religious part of it, but I do remember the famous example in India when Ashoka, who became Ashoka the Great of India, who was a barbaric king, who expanded an empire in India, and then he came through Jainism or whatever to Buddhism, and we relinquished all that had gone before.
Yeah.
And what I would say to people who win or conquer or whatever, if they could read about Ashoka, it might be a good idea, not only for Sri Lanka, because as you know in Sri Lanka, the Indian politics also, involves itself in Sri Lanka. So all our neighbors who take an interest in Sri Lanka, they need to read that, because a king so powerful, I mean, just think of the idea of tomorrow, I give up my power.
Yeah.
What's going to happen? All your past enemies are going to come and finish you off. But that didn't happen. Ashoka continued to rule in India. So there is a power of people who believe in religion or spirituality, but others, it could be this Nelson Mandela's, powerful idea that kept Ashoka safe and a continuity in India for many, many decades. I don't quite know how many decades, but I think we all can benefit from reading about Ashoka.
That's a very good one, yeah. I didn't think of that. I just studied in fourth year history in India, and the Indian system, it was rote
I
learning.
think we need
I couldn't quote several bits of it, but I can't tell you.
Any more questions? If not, yes, perhaps might be absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much.